Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edinburgh Book Festival, Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'll get sacked. My name is Rosemary Burnett. I'm delighted to be chairing this event with Lesley Riddoch today. Lesley has updated her handbook for how to run Scotland, what Scotland needs to flourish. And I'm delighted to be here chairing her. She's an award-winning broadcaster, writer and journalist. She writes weekly columns for the Scotsman and the National and is a regular contributor to The Guardian, BBC Question Time and Any Questions. She's the founder and director of Nordic Horizons, a policy group that brings Nordic experts to the Scottish Parliament and produces a popular weekly broadcast. Please welcome Lesley Riddoch. Lesley's going to start by reading an extract from her book.
Yeah, I'm never going to be on Question Time again, right? You know, I mean, obviously. But anyway, whatever. And it's funny that because it was a Question Time that actually put me effectively onto the independence path, because I was on a programme, I think it was 2012, it was just after Alex Salmond had announced that there would be a referendum. And the producers said, there will be a question which is not directly asking how you vote, but if you don't answer, David Dimbleby will basically wheedle the answer out of you, and it won't be pretty. So I suggest that you think about it and come up with your own answer. And I thought at the time, well, that's actually my broadcasting career over then. And I thought, oh, well, whatever, So into the fray I went. The Blossom has got covers so many things, and it's actually a wee while since it was first published, and I wasn't quite sure what to read. But this is a section I hadn't really read much before. It is about Edinburgh and the contested nature of Edinburgh. And since much of the book is really asking us to look again at what we accept as normal about Scotland, on the basis that Scotland is generally weird in almost every respect, then this is maybe not such a bad place to start. Edinburgh's new town is the crowning achievement and physical embodiment of Britain's finest hour, when the Jacobite challenge and old Celtic Highland ways of life were vanquished at Culloden. The practical need to expand beyond the overcrowded old town was harnessed to the political desire to appease triumphant Hanoverians and reassert the primacy of the newly created but almost toppled British state. So in 1767, James Craig devised a new town plan which reflected the ruling elite's love of classic antiquity and street names that reflected their naked power. Polite Edinburgh has never quite shaken off an unconscious preoccupation with those times and colonising outlooks. George Street, the largest and most prestigious thoroughfare, was named after King George III. Queen Street after his wife, Princes Street, originally planned as St. Giles Street, after his sons, Hanover Street after his family, Frederick Street after his dad, St. Andrews and St. George's Square, which later became Charlotte Square, hello, were named after the patron saints of the two recently unified nations, while Thistle Street and Rose Street represented their national emblems. Welcome to Edinburgh, where Britishness is still working its way through Scottish culture like a kidney stone. Take Holyrood, or Holyrood. Edinburgh's controversial Parliament building incorporates Queensberry House, whose most famous resident was James Douglas, 2nd Duke of Queensberry. In 1707, when the Duke signed away Scotland's independence in the Treaty of Union, riots allowed his violently insane son to escape the room in which he was normally locked and roast a servant boy alive on a spit in the kitchen. The Earl of Drumlanrig had started to eat the boy before he was discovered and caught. No charges were brought, and the cannibalistic idiot was whisked across the border to England. Astonishingly, the oven can still be seen in the Parliamentary Allowances Office. Why did architects decide an 18th century murder scene was worthy of saving at such great expense? Later in its career, Queensberry House was deployed as a hospital, barracks, a refuge for female inebriates, until, ironically, S&N breweries and then the Parliament bought the entire site. A contractor told me that behind the plaster, Queensberry House was a surprisingly poor building, assorted rubble, not dressed stone. I know arguments about building quality are subjective, but one thing's for sure. The decision to retain this List A historic building within Morales' new Parliament contributed to the complexity, delay, and the massive bill, which in turn nearly destroyed the early authority of Scotland's new Parliament. The Duke of Queensberry might have been quite amused. All that effort to preserve a building made special only by the appalling barbarity of his murderous son. In the old days, nobles and barons had the power to stifle dissent. Nowadays, an A listing does the job quite nicely. In Edinburgh, heritage is king, and its subjects dare not ask whose heritage we are preserving. Thanks.
You start Blossom by talking about Scottish identity, and there were two particular things that struck me. One was that you were talking about the Davy in Glasgow, and he talks about masculinity. And he says, our masculinity is built on our ability to withstand damage. We have to prove our worth by struggling against something. Now the work's gone, where does the damage come from? How can we prove that we're fit to be called men? The damage we withstand has to be self-inflicted new. It comes for fags, booze, and drugs. I thought that was really a startling statement.
Yeah, well, this was a piece about the Drumchapel Men's Health Group. There's many things I covered as a journalist which I sort of got involved with, covered, and then they never left me. I kept thinking about them and kept trying to fix them. And I was trying to support that group that was set up in the 1990s by a brilliant guy, Tommy Riley, who all the guys involved with it had substance abuse problems. Actually, Tommy was the only one who hadn't been an alcoholic. They decided that it was time to try and help themselves, which in the 1990s, self-help men's groups were kind of thin on the ground. In Drumchapel, they were gold dust. So those guys really persevered. Amazingly, they managed to get some money together. They got enough money to set up this men's health group. They ran it for a year. They had an 18-week waiting list for aromatherapy. They had massage classes. Most of the guys managed to give up smoking through acupuncture. And at the end of it, they had 40 trained volunteers. And any of you who are involved in projects that you'll know how tough that is to get 40 volunteers trained up after it in 1 year. In Drumchapel again, that was really incredible. And they didn't get their grant renewed. Greater Glasgow Health Board just decided it was too hard to see what tangible outcomes there'd been. And after that, Tommy tried to keep the whole thing going on his own. He couldn't. He then became an alcoholic. His marriage collapsed, and he died just as this book was published from COPD. But back then, I'd interviewed some of the guys they brought together, and Davy was one of the guys who then went on, as actually all of them have gone on to get good jobs as a result, really, of that strong foundation and the peer support they were able to offer each other. And I recorded them talking about masculinity, and really, I just thought it's extraordinary, and very possibly people in the room will be in the category of professional who is employed to try to analyze these problems and to offer medical or psychiatric help to these guys. And actually, they know. They're the experts, and yet they're the ones you look on Google and you will find no mention of this pioneering health project. No one was interested at all. So Davy was just really on the money. They'd all been broken, basically, by their lives, and yet the ethic of being masculine was really about how much damage you could withstand. And since the normal sources had stopped delivering the damage, they basically felt they had, in a sense, this was not a conscious thing, but having analyzed it, they realized they were showing that they were tough because that's what the whole name of the game is in the estates of Scotland. You need to look like you're tough or you go under. So they were still trying to do that with the only self-damaging substances available, which was, well, the full 9 yards. So that seems really important to me, and yet it strikes me, well, here's an example. After that book was published at the beginning, I was asked to give a talk. I mean, why me? In the Royal College of Surgeons or something, about the male underclass. And I started the whole thing, which I might do here, which is to say, who here has ever had LD? Right, do you know what LD is? Right, that's El Dorado wine, it's fortified wine. Now, if I was in Drumchapel and I asked if anyone had had wine, they would assume I was talking about LD, because the only point of drinking wine is to get drunk. So you only drink fortified wine. It's Lanlick, Lanny in Coatbridge. In different parts of Glasgow, it reflects the tribal nature of Glasgow, that you can distinguish yourself by which fortified wine you drink. And that's the reality. And the professionals didn't know or didn't recognize the very substance that most of the guys that they are interested in are using to try and obliterate reality. So, yes.
The other thing that struck me was about learned silence. You talk about Paulo Freire, discussion of inferiorism. And this idea of learned silence, I thought, was very relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah. Anybody heard of Paulo Freire? Yeah. He's a Brazilian who wrote an amazing book. It's not got a very snappy title, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. You'd be surprised where you find that one cropping up. I found it in the middle of practically a hurricane on Ascent, sitting inside a croft house, watching the late Alan McRae try to put sheep into a fank, rolling a cigarette as only crofters can do with one hand, and reading The Pedagogy of the Oppressed with the other. And I thought, my God, that's the pedagogy of the oppressed. Like, I'm the only person I've ever seen reading it. So Alan came in, and Alan, as you may know, was the powerful, eloquent orator at the heart of the Ascent Crofters buyout. A hybrid, as he always put it, because his mother was a Cockney. Hybrids are the strongest plants. And he was saying, this has explained to me practically everything, because we have learned you learn to be a second-class citizen. You learn skills. It's a skilled job. You have to learn to keep your head down. You have to learn to have very low expectations. You have to learn to keep your children under control so they don't act bolshy and single themselves out. You have to learn that your objective is to get your children out of your home, completely away from the situation. You learn all these things as skills, and any learned skill set wants to be exercised. So long after the conditions have changed, you're still exercising the skill set. And what Freire said, I mean, with relevance to Brazilian peasants was, and this is what then fueled the whole emphasis on education that still works around Brazil, is that people have to go through, educate themselves out of that mindset. It doesn't fall away. Now, I don't know, does this ring any bells with you? You know, I see this having, my mother came from Caithness, my dad came from a road junction in Banffshire, and a lot of my contacts and, you know, affiliation, as it were, is with the Highlands, and I was a trustee of the Isle of Egg Trust for 8 years. And I saw Paulo Freire in action every waking day. I see it still, because people are learning to keep their heads down, and it feels right. That's the killer. If it felt wrong, we would start to discard it. But we have a society that reinforces those low horizons. So yeah, Paulo Freire, massively important. And it would be great if there's a publisher here. How about republishing it? You know, because it never stops having a relevance.
Of course, you could retitle it as well, because it's just a for translation of the Portuguese. It doesn't really ring true in English.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's got a certain sort of retro cool, hasn't it? Do you remember the days where we might call things like that, you know? Anyway, yeah.
We started talking about Davy and community involvement, and you reference West Whitlow Burn as a housing cooperative, and that's quite an inspiring story. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, this is basically West Whitlow Burn. Anyone know where it is? It's in Rutherglen. Anyone know where it is? Right. You've seen it on the signs, eh? So anyway, Rutherglen, kind of southeast Glasgow. West Whitlow Burn, it was a massive sprawling council estate. In the 1970s, they discovered that Glasgow City Council had got a pot of money to do refurbishment. Great, because already there was gales coming through the windows that were badly fitted. The verandas were slightly beginning to fall to pieces. You know, the usual stuff about the 60s tower blocks. And then the council decided to spend the entire refurb money on East Whitlow Burn, because East Whitlow Burn was low rise and it's easier to retrofit. As we're seeing now in everything from Grenfell right through, tower blocks are a real problem to fix. So the folk in the tower block realized they were stuffed. They would always be living in rubbish flats. And then they decided to do something pretty significant, which was they decided to buy those tower blocks out themselves. Now, this is 1989. This is way before all community empowerment stuff. In fact, this was probably the first land buyout, community land buyout in Scottish history. Nobody knows. It took a wee while. There was 4 people at the middle of it, actually, 2 of whom I met. And they were quite important in trying to kind of boost people's confidence that they could do better than just having to tolerate this kind of bad living. They held their noses and took £2.2 million from the Tory government. And they really had to hold their noses because almost all of them were paid up communists. But they took that money because, as you might remember, the Tories were very keen at that point on trying to kind of move housing out of council control. So they got that money, bought the flats, and I think on the 29th of November 1989, they woke up as the proud owners of 600 of the crappiest flats in Europe. And I mean, if that's not courage, I don't know what is, because the council had run screaming away from the flats as unfixable, and actually it had run screaming away from them over a long time. They had the worst education rates, the highest unemployment rates, the worst health outcomes, you name it. West Whitlow Burn was in one of the wards of multiple deprivation and still is. But I mean, rapidly they began to turn that place around. They put in CCTV a lot, and that might not be how you want to live, but it stopped drug dealers. Within a month, they had stopped getting drug dealers on site. It also meant that if anyone had an accident, the 24/7 Jannies could come and basically help them. They saved 11 lives by doing that. They had buttons in flats for older people, so if folk just felt unwell in the middle of the night, one of the Jannies would come up and just have a cup of tea with them, keep them company, keep them focused, and keep them out of hospital. You know, we all know there's something like £2.5 billion spent a year on non-emergency admissions to hospital of older people because there's nobody to help them. And it generally happens in the middle of the night, nobody knows what to do, they never come back out again because there's no support, there's no home. But West Whitlow Burn created a community home for everyone, and it now has an 18-month waiting list, it has a green district heating system. It's great. And when I asked Phil Welsh, who was one of the 4 that started it, what was it about you that thought you had the wherewithal to run a housing cooperative like this? Did you have management experience? And there's massive guffaws. Management experience? No way. But then someone said, aye. And Phil was a shop steward of the Boilermakers Union for 37 years. Is that management experience? He ran not 1, but 3 junior football teams. Now, I used to think junior football teams were like for 14-year-olds. They're not. They're for like the grown men in the audience and your animals. And he ran 3 of them, and he had no management experience. And Muriel Alcock was a nurse. There's no management experience in that, is there? And the other two women ran shops on their own. They were shop assistants. They ran those shops on their own, mediating all the problems of that community on their own, day in, day out, nae help, nae cavalry, and they had no management experience either. And you see what it is. They just didn't have a bunch of letters after their names. They didn't have degrees, but they knew very well how to manage things. In fact, they knew how so well that they flipped through Margaret Thatcher's right to buy legislation, which has knackered loads and loads of housing associations because it means their housing stock keeps falling off the end. And they noticed that if you were a fully mutual housing cooperative, the right to buy wasn't extended to you. That didn't apply. So they formed a fully mutual housing cooperative. And what is that, I hear you ask? It is that the board has to be completely composed of your own folk. It has to be just tenants from your your cooperative. No professionals, not even drafted in tenants from another posher neighbouring place. You need the confidence to say, we have the skills to run this place and no one else. And that's what they set up. And that's why there's 9 fully mutual housing cooperatives in Scotland only. And those guys in West Whitlowburn have been building housing that they haven't lost since 1989, whilst every other housing association that is professionally led has had to accommodate the buyouts, which have diminished their stock. So who are the clever ones? And who are not rated simply because they don't come across as professional? One of the huge problems of this country is a professional class which has no confidence in the majority of Scots. And I know I'm talking to the professional class. I include myself. But one of the biggest difficulties is that our systems and our structures are basically feudal, they are hierarchical, they're top down, and they operate on the basis that the little people would make one hell of a mess of it if the power ever started to come a bit closer to where the rest of Europe keeps its power, which is at the natural, organic community level. So we have power up here in every structure imaginable. We then have liaison groups, umbrella groups, all sorts of ways to look like you're talking to each other but keep the power away from the little folk. And it's killing us, quite literally. That disempowerment that is the norm, the expectation that there's always someone over your shoulder that you have to account to, the stress that creates in workplaces that are formed in that way. That's what we're living with, and that's what we think is normal, and it just isn't normal, and it has to change.
You talk about the local authorities. You give some figures. I think we have 32 local authorities.
It's a real shocker. I mean, this sounds boring, but I mean, the average size of a local authority in Scotland is now 170,000 people. Right, as usual, I see no faces filled with shock in the front seats. But that's normal because, who knows what a normal size of a local authority is? You don't go on holiday and quiz folk. What's the average size of your local authority, mate? But the average size, 170,000 here, the average size across the EU, 10,000. The average in Germany, 7,000. And the average size, let's say Germany is no slouch in most respects. It's a powerhouse. And the source of its power is the knitting together of real harmonious power at the local level. So the size of the average local authority in Germany is 15 square kilometres. That's the physical size. The physical size of the average so-called local authority in Scotland, 990 square kilometres. Our cousins in Norway have 422 councils. The rule is that you shouldn't be more than half an hour's drive from the council headquarters. 422 in Norway, 5 million people. 32 in Scotland, 5 million people. We have no idea how we have lost ourselves. And again, we've become completely used. And in cities, the cities are actually roughly similar. In nearly all the Nordic countries, there is one commune or municipality that runs a city that's about 500,000 to 600,000. So that tells you even more how the average in Scotland is the towns. And much as it may vex folk from the big cities, the average Scot does not live in Edinburgh or Glasgow. They live in a town. And the towns of Scotland are knackered. They have people who want to help, people who are prepared to do community buyouts sometimes, not so much of towns, but of villages. And yet, the structures that we're all struggling against sit there undisturbed, overlarge everything, as if we're marking the feudal land ownership we only got rid of. We only got rid of feudalism in our legal system in 2001. The rest of Europe got rid of it where it existed in 1801 with the Napoleonic Code. We have struggled along for 200 years longer than everyone else with these overlarge units. Then throw in Thatcher's belief, and it sits in British society generally, that big is beautiful, and the bigger, the more efficient the operation will be, and you end up cooked with this sort of solution to local government, which is so unloved. And this is not talking about councillors, because a lot of them are doing their damnedest to try to connect up and be everywhere. My very good friend Jean Urquhart was a councillor in Highland region. She had the largest ward in Europe. It took her a day to get to about 3 or 4 places within it. And I used to find her. She'd finally get home. I found her once outside her house, asleep at the wheel. She'd managed to get home, but she hadn't actually got into the house. So councillors are often trying quite hard. But what is it that we just can't accept? The structures of Scotland need updating. We are not a feudal society anymore. It is not okay to have 37 dukes in Britain, all of whom own land in Scotland. It is not okay. It is very, very not okay to have one duke, the Duke of Buccleuch, who has probably been the patron of the Edinburgh Festival, he's been the blooming patron of everything else, who owns 1% of the Scottish landmass. People are aghast and amazed at that. We have gone quiet because it's so normal and we feel there's nothing we can do about it. So all wake up. This is such a fabulous country. There is such talent and capacity amongst the average person, and they are starved of the chance to realize that about themselves.
So staying with land for a minute, it's just past the 12th of August, the glorious 12th. Most of the land in Scotland is given over to deer or grouse or hunting and shooting and fishing in some form or another. Do you want to tell us about how that works and how it might work?
Yeah, well, there's a bit in the book which it's very important that people don't think Scotland's land is crap. I mean, that is the lie we've been sold, that basically a lot of the areas are so barren that actually landowners are doing us a favour, to be honest. You know what I mean? I mean, like, what would we do? They're taking it off our hands as a problem. And there's nothing else you could do with it anyway because it looks so barren. And I mean, a lot of us have kind of fallen for that. I came across 2 guys, Derek Pretzwell and Ron Greer from Perthshire, ecologists who are just very interested in trying to basically re-tree the empty parts of Perthshire. I think we've got maybe some slides here. There they are. Probably 30 years ago now, they managed to persuade the then landowner to give them a tiny bit of land to conduct an experiment. This is the bit of land next. Right. Would you think you could plant anything there? That is the result of overgrazing. That's of deer and sheep, and that's both because of the ability to do what you want, but also subsidy regimes that we have not questioned. So that destabilizes the land, and you end up with these unstable slopes that then are literally a slippery slope because there's nothing holding that together. Now, the received wisdom is you can't do anything with that, eh? You know, that's it. So Ron's belief was that if you planted lupins and Scotch broom, it stabilizes the bank, it returns nitrogen to the soil, it protects the tree saplings, and it increases the heat at the roots, all of which is a bunch of advantages are what you need to have a forest grow on something as bad as this. So he did it. There's year one, where you see all the lupins, and everyone said, "You're mad. You've killed the trees. There's only lupins." Next year, "You're mad. You've killed the trees. There's only Scotch broom." The next year, yep, he's getting there. And finally, that's that piece of land. Now, it's really important because seeing is believing. And if you've ever traveled up the A9, you'll have noticed that the Central Reservation has got trees. That's because the little teeth don't get there. That's what our country is capable of. Now, Ron and Derek, having done that, made a bid to have 100,000 acres of Perthshire bought to go into a community trust, and they were going to do that across all those barren areas. This is around Dalnaspittle, that kind of, nowhere zone when you get halfway up the A9. And it looked quite good. Scottish Enterprise had even come in to support them, which, began to just, well, it looked like it was either going to happen or not. And then suddenly, support was withdrawn, and all the guys were able to get out of Scottish Enterprise there was worry about the fact that they didn't have academic qualifications. Now, to be fair, that might or might not have been the reason, but the point is they were never given a reason other than that. So that 100,000 acres was just bought by another private buyer, and that was the end of that. And the point about it is, Ron, I don't think would mind me saying, he is an angry man. And everyone who has tried to do something about this country, who've put decades of their lives into it, and it always takes at least a decade. It's funny, it takes an hour to get anywhere in London, it takes a decade to get something done in Scotland. Those folk, if they don't come out the other side, they become where does energy go? They say that energy is never destroyed, it's only transformed in physics. Human energy isn't any different. You try to put your energy into something, it can't get any productive outcome. You eat yourself up. People become resentful, angry, drunk, drug abusing, self-harming, other harming. And an awful lot of it, I think, is the bottling up of the energy. It can't seem to ever find its way into something that you love. So these guys, the next thing that they wanted to tackle was the rest and be thankful. And for those of you I hear no response, so you're such an Edinburgh-based audience, do you ever go to Inverary? Because if you do, you'll regularly find you can't get past that bit, the rest and be thankful, because it's a slope, exactly like the slope at the beginning. And all that hardware has had to be put in to try and keep the slope intact. If they had been given the chance to do that 30 years ago, we would not be spending, hundreds of thousands not managing to keep that road open. And again, people without qualifications, but just with a lot of knowledge.
There's so much in your book. I've got a huge list of questions, but I think this will have to be our last one. Do you think that Indie Ref and maybe Brexit has changed the way Scots see themselves?
Yes, but it's actually, well, naturally I'm sort of mired in my own experience, and I realize now that I tend to meet independent supporting people, so it's harder to sort of gauge across the piece. For that independent supporting group, the levels of sort of empowerment in it are quite unbelievable. People who wouldn't have said boo to a goose have spoken in public, hired halls, worked with folk they'd never met before, gone out and tried to persuade people on the streets, invited guests, read up, perhaps above all, read up. The levels of self-education, you suddenly think, my God, I don't know anything about this. And there's a need to know for people who feel that they have to persuade others. I'm not so sure. I meet lots of campaigns now, and the National, for example, that I write for, The National is regularly the only place that takes very critical pieces about the need for land reform. And that seems ironic because it's a supporter, if you like, of independence and apparently the Scottish Government. But, you know, there's a sort of robustness, I find, around now, which certainly wasn't there beforehand, and a kind of also on-dutiness, because everyone who voted yes last time has remained ready. And that's quite difficult. It's quite uplifting because there's nearly always that connection with people quite randomly. I'm often just sitting minding my own business on trains. I remember I was coming down from Inverness and a woman came through looking for a loo that was working on the train and sort of came past me and said, "Are you Lesley Riddoch?" And I said, "Yeah." She went, "Wow, you came and spoke in Newton Moor. Do you remember?" And I think, God, I can't remember actually. She said, "The entire Newton Moor shinty team is here, 2 carriages down," you know. And I thought, oh my God.
That's big.
In my old drinking days, I would have been down there like a whippet, you know. But that seemed a slightly daunting thought because they'd all spent the day in the pub in Inverness. So I said, "Oh, you're fine, actually. I'll just sit here." And, you know, she went back down eventually. We had a wee conversation. "Do you think it's going to come? Do you think we're going to get into Ref 2?" Which is a daily conversation. So she went back down the corridor and then brought the entire shinty team back up again. And I mean, you know, that is like a normal experience for me now. And what an amazing thing it is to know that at random and unpredictably, a group of people will simply decide that there's a kind of connection between you which is strong enough for all sorts of other social and other kind of barriers to just drop away. And that's fabulous. I just don't know how much that's happening for folk who voted no. I can't know that. And I wonder if that's a slight issue because there's now, it feels to me as a slightly two-speed Scotland in terms of the willingness to do stuff, think differently, embrace things like, you know, the Catalan struggle. I mean, I don't know how many people here have been quite interested in Catalonia. That probably wouldn't have happened so much. You know, if we didn't sort of see parallels and start thinking, hang on a minute, it's not just us, is it? So, yeah. Brexit, honestly, do you even want to talk about it?
Not really.
No.
So
well, it's just not. I mean, obviously it's changed everything because the car crash is coming. And I think I hope it's the case. I meet a lot of no voters who say they just couldn't quite believe the British establishment could possibly be that self-harming, as it were. And yes, they can. So that should be focusing minds wonderfully. I do think what's happened now is that a lot of people, including former no voters, have sort of detached their faith from the British state or from Westminster as a form of governance. But they haven't yet attached to the idea of an independent Scotland. That bit, it strikes me, would be awfully useful to have a little bit more shape and strategy coming from folk who are kind of employed to do that soon. But I think that process will happen, and to an extent, actually, I don't like to be told what to think. I like to, you know, make my own mind up and talk to people, and I think that's quietly happening all over Scotland, but I could be wrong.
Well, it's time for your questions now, and I'm sure you've got hundreds. If you could put your hands up and wait for the microphone to come to you. There's a person here in the front, in the third row.
Thank you, Lesley. Your entire career in journalism and broadcasting has been about telling stories about how ordinary people achieve extraordinary things. And I would say that also includes your own career and life. And I'm wondering, since we've been so let down by the BBC for many years, what might an Alba Broadcasting Cooperative look like in an independent Scotland?
Right. You see, it's an interesting one, because I wasted 18 months of my life trying to set up a kind of independent alternative to Radio Scotland, which would be based on the fact that we could have taken podcasts, actually, from lots of different sources abroad, including PBS in America, who were quite willing to work with us. And that would have allowed us to plough all our money into home broadcasting, because we would get our foreign news covered by the local broadcasters, which is what you don't hear. If there's an American election, you hear British correspondents telling you what they think about the American election. This would have just been from the horse's mouth, foreign news from everywhere. We then went in to speak to the owners of Bauer, who own all the independent radio in Scotland. They are broadcasting on medium wave and FM. They're just rebroadcasting their music, basically, on medium wave, which sounds pretty rubbish, because medium wave is pretty rubbish for music. And we suggested that we would like to buy all their medium wave frequencies off them, because medium wave already has Radio 5. It's a speech network, so there's a sort of speech thing on medium wave. And the Scottish Bauer guy said, that's an interesting proposition. He said, it's just a shame that the owners have never yet sold an asset in their entire lives. So that's what killed that one. And I would have to say there was no support from the Scottish government for it either. Now, broadcasting is not devolved. There's a lot of things that aren't devolved. Are we going to just make an effort here at all? I don't know. But I'm not spending another 18 months on stuff with the posse not behind me. As far as television and a new Independent Scotland's concerned, the thing is, if you put an independent channel up, let's look at the new Scottish channel. How many people regularly, let's say more than 3 times a week, watch the new Scottish channel? So the difficulty is that what needed to happen is that BBC One Scotland needed to be the new channel. What needed to happen is that BBC One Scotland's programming needed to be handed to Scots, who would then just vary the mix completely according to, whatever. And the difficulty is, every time you create an opt-out, you put it's just like the opt-outs, the community land buyouts. What we need is fair laws governing land. If you go to, countries that don't have the problems we have, they don't have any opt-outs, they have basically fair laws. And so what we tend to do is we leave the crap law intact, and we make a wee opt-out over here for folk if they're tough enough, if they're hardy enough, if they're persistent enough, if they go on enough. That keeps them quiet. So actually what has to happen is what was needed originally and what the BBC shirked and shrunk from, which was it needed a Scottish 6, not anything off in a separate channel. It needs certainly more time, probably at least 2 channels. I mean, RTE, has it got 2 or 3 channels? We need more space, that's for sure, but the prime time stuff should not be competing with its own channel, which is what it is at the minute. So there's so much that needs doing, but the thing that just kills me is the sort of weariness now of a lot of the broadcasting. All the stories I've told you were programme ideas proposed when I worked at the BBC. All of them were rejected. There's so many stories to tell and not enough space for it all. And somehow it never gets commissioned. So like last year, some of you might have seen some of the 3 films about the Norway, Faroes and Iceland. I didn't even bother going to the BBC before that because I knew they wouldn't get commissioned.
There was a question up there somewhere. No, down here then.
And then we need a woman.
I know. I'm looking.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say 4 things.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you properly.
Yeah. What you've got is a person.
Yes, that's fair. But honestly, if you don't sometimes regulate it, I'm not been trying to be funny blokes, but you can end up with no women asking questions, so apologies.
Right. I'm not sure if it's exactly a question, more some statements. The first is the Edinburgh version was VP wine, which was good for your health, so anybody could buy it, and it was a refuge for many lonely people of all classes. The second thing is that I would like to thank you for all you've done for the people of Scotland on behalf of myself and everybody here. The third thing is this business of people having management skills. And when I started my career, a lot of women used to go for jobs and say, oh, I'm just a housewife, not realizing that the housewife has probably one of the most complex management activities of anybody. And you could say that of a man or a woman bringing up a family. That's the biggest management job you'll ever do. And the last thing is a recommendation that the next time you go to vote, that you first check that your ballot has a number on it, has something on the back. And the second is that you use a biro to mark your cross, because somebody might rub it out if it's in pencil.
Right, fine, these are good practical points.
There's a lady over here.
Thank you. I could sit and listen to you all day, Lesley. I just find myself nodding continuously, so my head might drop off. I was interested, you started off your talk about masculinity in Scotland, and I've been working in the space of gender equality in the workplace, predominantly focusing on supporting women after realising I'd spent years supporting professional white middle-class men. I wondered about your take on how the gender equality and the reforming masculinity tie together, because it feels like what we need to be doing as a nation is to be supporting all Scots to feel empowered, not by reference to the opposite gender, but just as a nation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that actually is a striking thing that I noticed within the independence referendum, because you'll remember there was a gender gap working throughout it where women were less likely to support independence than men. And actually, as the penny began to drop with a lot of guys, that they're slightly hogging the space at meetings and having that blue vein thumping thing where it, was putting off women. And actually, if you wanted the goal, you had to just shut up. Now, that was quite a moment in a lot of meetings for a lot of people. I was one of the co-founders of a feminist magazine, Harpies and Quines, that some of you might remember. And the rest of the kind of collective were actually really opposed to Scottish independence. And the reason was, one of them said it, every time somebody lectures me, it's a guy who, in what became a description common at the time, is a heart nationalist. It's somebody who's already there and just can't see why you can't get it. And that vein in the forehead thing was often commented, on somebody who just stands and rants at you, basically. These might be sweeping generalizations, because I think there's a lot of women who are heart nationalists, if you like, but there's an awful lot more who've, over their lifetimes, made practical considerations about it and thought, like I do, will we ever get rid of Trident without independence? No, we won't. Will we ever, reverse some of these patterns that are built into the way the British state operates? No. Did we actually, the reason that we had to wait to abolish feudalism in Scotland till 2001 is because previous attempts were talked out by the House of Lords. Do we feel it's okay, in general in life to have that level of unfairness, that we have the second largest unelected chamber in the world after the People's Congress of China? You could go on and on and on, and finally you look at it and you think, that's a crock of shit, right? And that's the way I think a lot of people arrive at, but I think a lot of women are much more, they get there by analysing stuff in a quite practical way. So, yeah, I think there's been a lot of more respect, actually. Every meeting I'm in makes a lot more space for minority voices, and men are holding back their natural inclination, their learnt inclination to want to voice up first and second and third. So that is incredible, because when you change the players, you change the tune. When you begin to think that there's people in the room that might have a better contribution or whatever than you really believe it, it's funny, they come forward. Every time I've interrupted the sequence of questioning in a meeting, the next question from a woman has been a stoter that's left people going, oh my God, and me usually. So, we have to change who thinks they are the entitled folk. And that to me, that includes myself, which is why a lot of my effort was to put the stories of people who've been my inspiration on paper, and there's so many more. So, yeah, I totally agree.
Another question, there's one over there.
And it's interesting now, the only people who've put their hands up are women.
They're worried about their
You are allowed to come back in, the guys, if you want.
Another woman, I'm afraid.
Yep.
Thank you for Blossom, firstly. Can I just ask, you cover so many amazing topics in Blossom. I'm interested to find out, in the 6 years since it was published, which aspects, if any, do you feel are making or might make some progress in the way that you would like to see it happen?
Right, see, that's the killer one, isn't it? Not many, actually. And this is the difficulty, because this is where, well, as you know, land, yeah, there's been a little bit of movement, but we still have, let's look at Duke of Buccleuch land. He's still able to he doesn't even have to evict people, because the way that tenant farmers work is on limited partnerships which expire. So you can be there for 22 years on a series of year renewals. So he doesn't renew contracts because the Forestry Commission will give him grants to plant trees in our name, and that will extend the pattern of forestry ownership, which is actually even more concentrated than land ownership in the terms of the tiny number of people. That is utterly atypical of our latitude. That hasn't changed, and despite trying to champion the couple who are brave enough to come over the parapet, David and Alison Telfer, and object to what was happening, there is no change to that. All that's happened, I guess, is Buccleuch realises it's not a good look, and has had to put some land up for sale. So it's been bought by other large forestry companies who understood that they have to give the Telfers another 5 years until they retire. Where the hell they're going to go then, I don't know. Again, expectations very low. But that basically just puts that bit of land back into another massive forestry ownership. So we're not chunking it down at all on any of these things. Local democracy, there are community buyouts, yes, all over the place, and that's great because it gets people's peckers up. But, we will not reform Scotland by community after community spending 10 years or less to buy Scotland out acre by acre. That is just crazy. We need law changes. Andy Whiteman, who's a very good friend of mine, has done his dinger in the Scottish Parliament, trying to put forward proposals that would change things. And the SNP have voted with the Tories to oppose him on almost all of them. And he is thoroughly demoralised. So, yeah, we need to stand up or stand down independence soon, because we need to get a more vigorous politics where there's an actual party, unlike the Labour Party, that occupies space and uses it as a critical opposition to the SNP. That's got to happen, and we can't keep prolonging the day when we begin to get engagement and some sort of representation of what I find is generally a lot of people who are fed up with the centralised top-down patterns which any political party that has grown up in the current system almost inevitably reproduces. Because you only know what you know, where you've lived, what's normal for you. I was lucky being dumped by the BBC because it gave me time to gad about, and I began to understand a lot about how the Nordics worked. Without seeing that difference and how it worked, I wouldn't have the conviction that what we have here doesn't have to happen like this.
Okay, there's a brave person right at the back.
Lesley, you've talked a lot about low learned expectations, and I wondered if you think that we might look back in 10 or 15 years' time and recognise that it was always, as with devolution, going to take 2 shots to get independence because of our low learned expectations, and that if the referendum in 2014 had been won by 1 or 2%, that might have actually landed us in an awful lot of trouble, which perhaps wouldn't be the case if we win it next time by a much bigger convincing margin.
Well, possibly. I mean, I don't think any of us who went hell for leather to advocate for independence, right up to the 51% poll, I didn't really think we were likely to win. I don't know what other people felt. I was always conscious that there's a bit of a bubble surrounding all of our activities. So, that's very possibly true. However, there has to be a point where we're able to seize the moment, and there has to as well be a point where there's been a lot of joint planning of what the new strategy would be Now, there was a lot of decisions made by the SNP about what was in their, blueprint, which was taken by a very small number of people. And I would love to think that the next time round, it ain't going to happen, there are more brains put into it, because there is not a business in the world, there is not a proposition in the world that doesn't benefit from having input from a diverse group, well managed, like the Citizens Assembly idea, which I'm a big supporter of. Then you whittle it down to ideas and you really cook them with experts who know. Like, for example, renewable energy. It just baffled me that a lot of people don't realize yet that energy is a reserved issue in Westminster. We can't shift to the way we need to shift unless we get all those powers back yesterday. That alone didn't get it pushed out, I think, well enough. And I would love us to be pulling together a strategy now on every single point. It's not just Brexit. It's not just Boris. Those, if you like, those are the kind of icings on the cake, but they could go. We're simultaneously arguing there shouldn't be Brexit, there shouldn't be a hard Brexit. Does that mean we then lose our case for independence because we've lost the thorn in our side? We need a much stronger case now, and I think actually a lot of professionals too can see that the way to kind of get where you might want to go is to not be having to pussyfoot around structures which basically suggest that the society has to work within the marketplace instead of the market being a part of society. That's where we need to get to.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, but Lesley will be signing copies of her wonderful book, Blossom, in the signing tent next door. Please join with me in thanking her very much for a most stimulating hour.
Thanks, Rosemary. Thank you.